Hi, I'm Nal Marsh, and this is my midterm for Language in American Life. I decided to talk about how the Children of God cult uses language to manipulate its members. The Children of God, it was an infamous cult that started in the 70s um, and was, at its height, had about 15,000 members in over 100 countries and hundreds of communes around the world. The cult is infamous for the allegations of child abuse and child sex abuse, and a lot of survivors of the cult have come out and talked about it. Um, there you go. Quick overview of what I'm going to cover. My thesis is basically that the cult uses a mixture of linguistic strategies to control and psychologically manipulate members, and this manipulation is very effective. Um, the different strategies I'm going to talk about are family monikers for all members, language instead of medicine, extreme punishments for voicing dissent, different words used for abusive behavior, and intense vocal sessions of connection. So we're going to cover all of that. My sources are two cult memoirs, Uncultured by Daniela Young and Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing by Lauren Hugh. Both women write about their experiences in the cult with very specific detail, citing other members' memories as well as their own. So the data is not a primary source like a recording for me to analyze, but given the type of material, the verification from so many sources, and the inclusion of so many different experiences, even just within two books, I do feel comfortable analyzing the cult's language with these sources. It is from the perspective of these two women. Both of them went on to join the military afterwards, so they have that added perspective as well. Okay, first part, family monikers. There's going to be a lot of big chunks of text like this. You can pause and read them if you want to, but I'm just going to highlight the parts that I'm talking about. This is talking about how the cult renamed itself a few times and settled on the family, which is obviously a pretty manipulative name, presenting the cult as this wholesome, family friendly thing when it is not. The cult leader called himself dad or grandpa, depending on what generation you were in with the cult, which is again extremely manipulative. All the men were called uncle and all the women were called auntie, regardless of their blood relation to anybody. Um, so if you're a child in this cult, and this is largely going to be from the perspective of a child in the cult because those are my sources. If every adult around you is calling themselves by some sort of family name, um, I feel like it's like pretty intensely gaslighting the victims that do you really think these people who are part of your family, the family, would hurt you and do all these things that the systemites, the people outside the cult, would say that they are. I identified it as manipulative stance taking. I don't know if that's a thing, but they kind of take a stance as, oh, I'm like a close family member of you. I'm a protector of you, and actually they're abusers. So that's family monikers. Up next, language instead of medicine. There's a couple examples of this. From Hugh's book, she talks about names as medical treatment. There was a girl who had asthma who was named Victory to medicinally treat the asthma, which is interesting. There was a lot of renaming in the cult, especially in Hugh's experience. She was more like Asia, Europe based. They did a lot of traveling when she was in the cult as a child, and she and her sisters changed names half a dozen times. She doesn't remember what all her names were because she was a child. Young talks about how the entire commune would help heal people through prayer, basically just like words and sometimes rubbing oil on people. She had a couple incidents when she was a child where she got very seriously injured and had to go to the hospital, which is when they bring up um, the there was a lot of, I guess, lore about outside doctors within the cult that they were antichrist soldiers, that they were systemites, that they were putting toxins in the children, etc. So Young was not given any pain medication, or they didn't take her to the hospitals except as a last resort, even when she like badly broke her leg or sliced her hand open, stuff like that. I kind of related this to Amanda Montell's book Cultish, where she talks about how groups enforce a us versus them dichotomy and naming doctors, like people who are literally supposed to help you heal, as antichrist soldiers, um, is a pretty strong example of that. This is kind of cult 101, but we'll get into more extreme examples as well. There's also a lot about how pregnant people were not to give birth in the hospital at all. And Young's mother had a C-section when she had her. Oh no, she had an epidural when she had her, and that was like very frowned upon. And then after the birth, it was a C-section. After the birth, the doctors were like, yeah, she would have died if this didn't happen. And the whole cult like switched. They switched it up, and they were like, oh my gosh, this was God's plan all along. It was wild. Moving on. Punishment for using the wrong words. So the washing out mouths with soap for children. Young talks a lot about it. It happened a lot in her commune, and it was a pretty rough experience for her and the other children. And it was used to combat signs of the devil like foul language or taking the Lord's name in vain or gossiping. So really trying to enforce a particular type of linguistic behavior from even the kids, like what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. Um, I think this again relates to some stuff that Montel wrote about how in cults the ends justify the means, so it's okay to abuse your children like this if you are combating signs of the devil. And an even more extreme example of this, here we go, is Hugh's example of going through an exorcism, because Hugh is a lesbian. Um, and she wrote a lot about the exorcisms, about how she would be hit and someone would be screaming and cursing at her. But they would they say the ends justify the means, because we're not actually abusing the child, we're just trying to get this demon out of the child, etc. So again, we're getting into like renaming behavior, abusive behavior, that's to make it okay and justifiable. And along that vein, so Young talks about how she was punished. This is after like a spanking, because someone in the nap room had been loud, so everybody got hit. And after that, she had to thank the person who hit her, who was actually her stepdad, because he had like helped her somehow through this punishment. I think this is an example of a thought terminating cliche, which we talked about in class, I think on the 12th of October. Of, I guess, like if you're like thanking your abuser for it, then it can't be abuse. And also the sort of thought terminating cliche of like, it's for your own good, or this hurts you more than it hurts me, or this hurts me more than it hurts you, which was said quite a lot in the Children of God. Another example of renaming abuse. Rape was not a thing in the family. I mean, it happened all the time, but they never called it that. They always called it sharing God's love. It was a sex cult, so saying no wasn't really an option to anybody in the cult. And this obviously caused problems for all the ex-members, especially the members who were children, when they were assaulted after they got out. So that's, I think, the most extreme example of renaming abuse. Moving on to the worship sessions. In our October 12th class about religious language use, we talked about how some religious groups have a language ideology that suggests it's important to show spontaneity as a part of religious sincerity. I took that right off Professor McIntosh's slide. So Hugh's recollection of what the speaking in tongues sessions would be like really relates to that, of if you are spontaneous and you're really intense about it, then it must be true. She talks about it as a mass delusion that she took part in, because she was afraid that if she didn't, she would be punished, which she would. Moving on. And then this relates to, both women talked about this relating to their time in the Army. Young especially talked about it. I know what this tone means, we own you. I know what is happening. I read about it online after signing my paperwork. They shock your system. They break you down, build you back up, like we talked about in class. And she says, soon I will no longer exist. There will only be the group. And Hugh does a lot of analysis about this. There we go, which I think is very good. Hugh talks about how these communal rituals are meant to shut down rational thought and reduce us to these instincts, the instincts being the need to identify with a group. And she says that you, like other people who aren't in a cult or the military, have probably felt the same high if you've gone to a concert or gone to a sports game or something like that. Identifying with a group is like very is very compelling to people. We all want to be part of a group. Montel talks about how brainwashing within a cult does require some self surrender. You have to buy in at least a little bit, and you could see that both in the military and also in the cult. As my final slide, Hugh writes that a cult needs control to function. They were all in foreign countries, but even if you speak the language, you don't use the cult language now. These linguistic strategies kept thousands of people in a dangerous, abusive situation, and the cult's mixture of linguistic strategies to control and psychologically manipulate members were highly effective. The Children of God still operates today. It's not at 15,000 strong anymore, but it is still around. And that's all I've got. Thank you for watching. Sorry this went a little long.